Alright, so everyone, and welcome to a very different kind of video, and one that I've been meaning to make for quite a while now, and it has to do with the Soviet focus tree. And I'm well aware that basically everyone has already said that the Soviet focus tree in Hearts of Iron 4 is quite lackluster, and it's quite obvious why that is. It's just not flexible enough, and while the streamlininess of it, or the streamlined nature of the overall focus tree, does represent the Soviet Union quite nicely in the way that they basically planned everything, I do think that there's quite a lot of room for improvement. And in this video, which hopefully will be a little bit shorter, I'll try and examine some of the aspects that I think I could improve, and I think that could be just overall improved in the Hearts of Iron 4 Soviet Union focus tree. Now, right off the bat, I'm gonna have to say I apologize for the very rudimentary nature of these drawings. I always wanted to be a graphic designer, but as you can see, never quite managed it. So, what's the basic idea behind this initial attempt at making a sort of an overhaul to the Soviet focus tree? Is that there's this national spirit in the Soviet Union, or of the Soviet Union, which deals with the Trotskyite plot. And the overall situation that the Soviet Union and Stalin himself found themselves in during the mid-1930s is obvious, basically dealing with a potential uprising and resentment towards his power, mostly from Trotskyite and Menshevik supporters at the time. That's where the deal with the plot focus comes in, and this is the focus tree side, or the side of the focus tree that deals with keeping the communists in power, or maybe revamping the Stalinist era of the communist side. And that's where the second line of the focus trees comes in, which are supposed to be mutually exclusive, of course. So right off the bat, as you can see, right in the middle, you have the Purge. This is the Great Purge focus. I think the overall Stalin line could remain basically unchanged. I think as a sort of a secondary focus tree set, or a secondary chain of focuses, I think the basic idea is sane, it's sound, it's not too terrible. You have the Great Purge, from then you move on to various claims in the Baltic and slowly trying to expand your socialist realm, but keeping in mind the state of the political influence that Stalin had and his political agenda, which was very much based around the socialism in one country. Now, these various claims have been disputed plenty of times, but the socialism in one country, instead of trying to keep the realm of the Soviet Union stable and trying to integrate some of the lost, let's say, provinces just to keep it in the spirit of the game, are sort of sane and sound when it comes to the overall nature of the focus tree. So from the Purge, you obviously move on with Stalin. You have the very few claims, the ultimatums, which is very much the strong suit of the Stalin tree that I propose in this overhaul, or this improvement. So you have claims in the Baltic, obviously through ultimatums. You do also Bessarabia, then move on to Finland, or whichever options you choose first. I think these should be sort of not streamlined, but available to you later on, in whichever order the player decides to go with it. And obviously a majority of these countries decide to accept, and later on this leads to war with Finland on historical focuses, obviously. However, when it comes to the Soviet Union, and more specifically these communist leaders, I think one important factor when playing with it, or playing around with these ideas, is that you also have to change the various bonuses that these leaders give you, because you're also staying within the realm of communism. So you have to change around the ideologies and the way you play with them. And one thing that I propose, or I think would be a very good change for Stalin, is to give him the trait socialism in one country, as well as the dictator spirit, or the dictator idea set that also, or trait, let's say. I'm not entirely sure how they call these various things, but I'm pretty sure it's trait. So you given the socialism in one country, which potentially reduces various political meddling, things that you can do with the Soviet Union. So your justifications take longer, your influence costs more political power, your lend-lease possibly costs a little bit more guns or isn't accepted as often, or you have to have a certain world tension to be able to send volunteers, because as it is right now in the base game, the Soviet Union sends volunteers to the Republicans in Spain quite often, and that's not quite how the Soviet Union of the time operated. You see a lot of lend-leasing, you see a lot of guns being sent, but you don't see a lot of divisions. And right now, when the Spanish Civil War kicks off, you can send up to, I think, 5 or 6 divisions, and that's just not how the overall Spanish Civil War operated. If anything, you see volunteers from various Western countries and that wanted to fight against fascism. However, you don't see a lot of direct military involvement when it comes to the Soviet side. So I think with Stalin, you should be able to you should be restricted in these various segments and keeping very much in line with the socialism in one country. And also the dictator trait, it's very obvious. If Adolf Hitler is a dictator, and if he has the extra 25% political power gain, or 15%, not entirely sure what it is right now, then Stalin definitely should have it also, because he was quite he's basically the quintessential dictator of the 20th century. So that's Stalin. It's very, very similar to how it is in the base game, just messing around a little bit with the traits. Moving on to Trotsky. I think that Trotsky is a very interesting persona in Hearts of Iron 4 and history also. When it comes to the alternate path you can take in the Soviet Union right now in Hearts of Iron 4, you have to have a civil war, and then he has his various traits, which I do agree, those traits are quite okay. However, there's basically no focus tree dedicated to having Trotsky, and I think that's a very big missed opportunity, because with Trotsky what you have is sort of a political meddling machine, and boosting communism, this constant revolution, perpetual revolutionary. Basically what this comes to is that his focus tree should be mostly focused not around gaining territory, but boosting communism and then initiating revolts. Let's say his initial focus, after you pick the Trotsky path, which could be the plot is victorious or something akin to that, is, let's say, spreading the revolution. That's like the name or the basic idea behind his entire focus tree. And what this does is it starts to spread communist influence throughout the entire, let's say, neighborhood of the Soviet Union in Europe. So you see increased communist support in Poland, in Romania, in the Baltic countries, and various other countries that directly border the Soviet Union. And of course, Soviet Union has a lot of borders, so you can disperse these various focuses around focusing on the Middle East, focusing on China, even Japan potentially, because they have now a very interesting communist focus tree. So after, let's say, you boost the popularity of a country to up to, let's say, 30%, then similarly to how the United Kingdom in its royalist focus tree has the ability to initiate a revolt of the imperialists, or the citizens or the political side still loyal to the British Empire or to the Crown. I think you should be able to initiate with Trotsky after you reach, let's say, 30%. It's just sort of a working number. You can, of course, manage that up and down and see which however you want to balance that. But 30%, I think it's a very sort of quaint number. It's quite nice, sort of very good for a revolution. But 30% support, you should have a decision to initiate a civil war or to ignite a civil war in said country. And what this does is the communist side immediately becomes your puppet, and you have the ability to enter the war or send volunteers, lend-lease, stuff like that, support the communist side. And then if you're victorious, obviously the entire country becomes your puppet. And this, working forwards, you can do this in Europe and in the Middle East, China, stuff like that. However, if you wait and the support reaches, let's say, 50%, then they have the ability to naturally flip themselves over to communism, or through, let's say, spending 100 political power, 120 political power, you can force them through like NKVD agents meddling with the governments of the, not quite NKVD, but you know what I mean, various Soviet agents meddling with the political systems of those various governments. You can force them to have a referendum, very similarly to, for example, the Anschluss. However, instead of absorbing those countries, you essentially flip them to communism, and this is quite interesting because it could mean that they become your puppet, or it could mean that they don't become your puppet. I think having a randomized chance on this would be very interesting. For example, Finland, even during the Russian Empire days, it had quite a lot of autonomy. Similarly to, for example, South Africa and the British Empire, or the Australasian colonies having a little bit of autonomy even before the First and Second World Wars. So Finland, I think, would have more of a chance of becoming a communist country, maybe ceding the various areas and then joining the Comintern, but not quite becoming your puppet. Let's say there's like a 20-80 chance of them becoming and not becoming. However, with, for example, the Baltic countries, they have a higher chance of becoming your puppets, etc., etc. You can have quite a lot of fun with this sort of randomized number chance, the RNG of them becoming your puppets or not. And so this would quite interestingly play the role of various historical interactions with those countries. You could also, for example, boost relations with those countries to try and make them your puppet, to increase the percentages, increase the RNG, the probability they would become your puppet. Or if they don't like you, they would go independent, not even join the Comintern, just become communist. And that might be enough for Trotsky. That might be enough because it's spreading the revolution. That's what he was all about. The world revolution, the perpetual revolution, which would ultimately see the workers of the world united or something akin to that. And while you might think that's a little bit OP, that's quite strong. In truth, I think that the Trotsky focus line, or a focus tree based around Leon Trotsky, would be quite interesting in its application due to the immense hatred that the Western powers had towards communism as this sort of foreign hostile idea, towards their very monarchist, capitalist systems that they had, which basically we have and had for quite a number of years, and even before then, up to this point, basically. And so you can see that even in various sort of alternate history scenarios and various sort of predictions, and even the overall sense you get from Trotsky, from his writings and from whatever he said, it's basically the idea that the actual peoples of Russia don't really matter too much. It's mostly about the revolution, want to spread it, disregarding basically the individual populations, because they aren't actually okay, nations don't matter. That basic idea. So you see him. So you see the initial focus is being extremely powerful. You manage to get like 5 puppets and from like 2 or 3 focuses, and it's extremely powerful. However, similarly to the Berlin-Moscow alliance or the Berlin-Moscow axis, this angers the world extraordinarily. You see the rising world tension, you see the hatred of not just the West, but also the Central European powers, for example, Germany, Italy, seeing this extreme threat of communism just ramping and trembling over all these ancient regimes and stuff like that that have been ruling for decades now, and just you see this Soviet Union suddenly just increasing in power. And basically what this does is it replaces Hitler's role as the main aggressor with his Anschluss and his Sudetenland, with Trotsky and the Soviet Union becoming this major force that now the West has to face off against, and suddenly ceding a small border region of Czechoslovakia, then eating up essentially 2 countries and maybe Slovenia and stuff like that, doesn't seem like much compared to just eating up half of Europe and becoming and then becoming communist regimes under the Soviet Union, which used to be Russia, and everybody's sort of confused what's going on. And I think this would sort of ferment a very immense hatred towards communism in general and towards the Soviet Union and the player who decides to go down the Trotsky path, making the initial stages of the Trotsky tree very powerful. However, what this does is it makes the neighbors of those countries extremely hateful towards you in the way of just willing to declare wars sort of out of fear, basically. You see Trotsky becoming the new Hitler is what I'm saying, and this means that we might find a possibility to make Germany join the Allies, even though they're fascist, the United States quickly joining the Allies, basically the entire world now teaming up against Trotsky and his puppets, or the Soviet Union and its puppets. And I think this would put the gameplay or the overall idea of this tree in quite an interesting position, because initially it's very strong and later on it gets fairly weak, whereas usually with focuses or focus trees you get quite weak at the start and later on you get a very big power surge. And as sort of a jumping off point for Trotsky, I think with the combination of his character traits as a leader of the Soviet Union, in combination with these various revolts and boosting political power or communist influence, through political power, and mostly disregarding the idea of some sort of treaties and stuff that's related to that. The world order basically has to submit to the communist order or whatever. I think this is a very interesting take on the situation that the Soviets found themselves in. I think even regarding some of the historical documents, it could be quite interesting to implement. For example, Churchill, up until basically the Soviets joined, after Barbarossa and the Soviets joined the Second World War, he was very hateful towards communism, and you see him basically regarding communism and fascism around the same level. But from his writings, I've read about 80% of his books, and from his writings you see the majority of his hatred that goes against communism. And I think that would be a very major point in him becoming sort of a staunch anti-communist. He even could get the trait, if you do enough political meddling, as Trotsky and Churchill takes power when Neville is out, or when if the United Kingdom goes through the motion of no confidence, and I think they would be more akin to the country itself. The AI would be more akin or more likely to go down the motion of no confidence if they see this sort of immense power and the East surging through this ideology that Churchill hated. If you see this, then the overall allies would be more willing to sort of to ally themselves with the Germans against the Soviets, similar to how they were willing to ally with themselves with the Soviets under Stalin against the Germans. So you have this little bit of a switcheroo, let's say. So that's Trotsky. And I think the last one with Maria Spiridonova, she's relatively unknown, but during the late 1910s, let's say early 1920s, she was a member of the Socialist Revolutionaries, who played a relatively big role in into the Communist Revolution, the Russian Civil War. And the one thing that you take away from her whenever you read about her is that she was like a very aggressive person. She was often called the revolutionary of the pistol and the grenade, and so I think, being the member of the Socialist Revolutionaries who basically disagreed with everything the Brest-Litovsk Treaty demanded of the Russians, basically losing half their lands, paying a lot of reparations, not necessarily reparations, but giving a lot of equipment to the Germans, basically giving them a lot of wheat, etc., etc. Being a member of this group, combined with her militarism, gives a lot of opportunity as a very big counterpoint to Trotsky, whereas Trotsky is more about political meddling, and Stalin is more about the ultimatums and taking a few provinces away, or very small countries away, for example the Baltic regions. Spiridonova could be a more militaristic leader, with, for example, some of her personal traits being Some personal traits being like army speed or faster recruitment, etc. More military focused. And one of the big things I think that would be quite interesting to see in her focus tree, or the focuses that relate to her path or the Spiridonova path, would be the direct military takeover of these various countries that used to be in the Soviet Union and now aren't. And while Stalin has his ultimatums and you have to sort of ask for them if they want to give up these territories, usually they say yes, of course, except for Finland, Poland, stuff like that. With Spiridonova, I think once you click that button, that focus button, in 70 days you will declare war. There's no like button, or there's no like war goal, anything like that. You just click it and you declare war. And I think this is this also quite interesting if you're taking into consideration one of the possibilities that you could have with Spiridonova, is that you have this sort of surprise attack factor within her character. For example, as Japan has various debuffs against nations in China, you deal essentially 50% less attack. You have essentially 50% less attack and defense against Chinese countries due to the surprise of the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and Japanese not being really all that prepared for something like that. With Spiridonova, it's the exact opposite. So, for example, you attack Poland out of the blue, let's say, and for, let's say, 20 or 30 days, you have 20 or 30% increase in attack and defense, or division speed and attack. Not really defense, that doesn't really fit her character, so let's say division speed and attack. And this really pushes you towards a mobile warfare, the Blitzkrieg doctrine, not quite something that the United States, that the USSR, I mean, is used to, and really changes up the character of the game. You really have to be aggressive now, playing as the Soviet Union. And the various focuses are not really related that much to the political situation. I think it's more of just taking over the countries that used to be within the Russian Empire and were taken away during the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, and for example, the Russians tried to take back in 1920 with the war with Poland. You can see sort of a reversal with Spiridonova, where they just attack every neighboring country that has at least one province that used to be within the Soviet Union. And interesting with Spiridonova might be an interesting factor because of the massive buffs that you have with these various attacks. Is sort of a slowly decaying buff. So for example, you attack Poland in 1937, let's say, and for those 30 days you have that 30% buff of attack. But then later on, like maybe right away, after that you attack Finland. However, you don't get a buff for 30 days, you only get it for, let's say, 20 days, and it's only a 15% buff. And then you attack Romania, and it's only for 10 days, and you only get like 5% or something akin to that. So those very early stages of your military dominance are strong because you have such a big army, and the surprise factor is there. However, after a time, the world is seeing this aggression from the USSR, and they're slowly preparing. The shock factor is simply not there. And again, very similar to Trotsky in the way that very early on you have a lot of potential, but later on you become a little less powerful. However, now that you have acquired all these territories, it becomes more convenient for you to maybe defend even against the potential aggression from the German side. And overall, just the situation in the world sees you as a threat very similar to that of the Germans, and the Germans will be even more willing to attack you, maybe even going after the USSR first instead of the Western allies, or maybe attacking both sides at once, or maybe again similar to Trotsky, somehow allying themselves with Western allies. And in many aspects, the Trotsky and Spiridonova trees could be believed to be similar. However, they're direct opposites when it comes to the way that you play the game. While Trotsky doesn't really rely on military power as much as it relies on political meddling, you don't necessarily engage in many military conflicts initially. Spiridonova is just about a military conflict right away, and you have to really focus on your military, foregoing some possible political advantages, even maybe foregoing some some members of the cabinet. Another interesting thing about Spiridonova would be some sort of purge that could happen of all the members of the Stalinist and even or the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks that were in the government, and possibly replacing them with just a couple of these couple of like military staffers, or the government cabinets. You maybe only have one guy there that just deals with infantry, and you have no one else to choose, and this would balance out basically the insane buffs that you get in the early game. Another interesting thing could be another interesting aspect of Spiridonova could be the inability to puppet various countries, because we're trying to focus more on the military side, and annexation is sort of thing we're going for. So I think these various trees could work off each other quite nicely. If you're more of the slow player, pick Trotsky. If you want to play more historically, and the historical path, you pick Stalin, who is sort of an in between. You see both sort of involvement in the political scheming as well as the military aspect of things. And if you go full military, if you want to go full military, go Spiridonova, but you forgo some political aspects of the game, and most of the political aspects of the game if you just want to focus on the military with Spiridonova. And I think these focuses could quite ramp up the sort of variety of play when it comes to the communist side of the USSR. However, when it comes to the alternate history paths, we have a lot of options as well. So let's say an mutually exclusive focus to the Trotsky plot, or dealing with the plot, would be Bolshevism Failed, where essentially, because of the various revolutions and the political instability that Russia / the Soviet Union went throughout the decades immediately preceding the 1930s, or basically when the game takes place, there were a lot of various governments that you previously saw in power. In this section of the world, let's say. And the way I imagine this Bolshevism Failed focus really taking effect is not quite in the same way that maybe the Oppose Hitler focus works when it comes to Germany. And when you pick Bolshevism Failed, you might see a slow and steady downtick in the popularity of communism within the Soviet Union. And this basically not only makes you sort of slowly crawl your way towards picking different sides of the spectrum that you find sort of appealing to you, it also makes sure that you have the ability to maybe prepare for what's coming, because on top of slowly decreasing your communism support, of course, I think that it would be interesting to play along with with this sort of system that I outlined a little bit with the Trotskyite tree, and that being the percentages of communism support within your country leading to a potential civil war. For example, I think the current popularity of communism in the USSR in the game 1936 is 80%. So let's say you pick Bolshevism Failed, and it slowly ticks downward. Let's say 0.20 points per day, which is quite fast, but obviously you want to pick your political stuff, so you don't have to wait like 20 years just to pick something. And let's say when it gets down to 50% of a communist support, you pick Legacy of the Duma. That leads to a civil war between the democratic side and the communist side, because obviously the communist side still has half the population on its side, and it's willing to fight for that support of or those 50% at least are willing to support the cause. And this leads to a civil war. It allows you to switch much faster to your desired ideology, or your desired political tree. However, it leads to a civil war. Now, it's up to you if you want to decide if you want to go through a civil war. Maybe you're competent enough to very quickly end the civil war. There's a lot of ways to exploit that, obviously, in the current build of the game. However, if you're not quick enough, or you don't think you're quick enough, or that you can handle the civil war, if you wait until the communist support has decreased to, let's say, 30%, again, magic number, 30%, Once you pick after it's only 30%, roughly all the ideologies will have roughly the same number of supporters or the same number of support within the populace. So then if you pick Legacy of the Duma, which is the democratic path, of course the Duma being the initial parliament that took over after the fall of the Tsar, or the fall of the Tsarist regime in 1917, the February Revolution, then you go down the democratic path without a civil war if you waited for those 30%. And that basically means that you get to flip to democratic like that. You bring back Kerensky, re-establish the Kerensky Duma government. What this means is that you essentially enter stage of a democratic Russia. And the way I imagine a democratic Russia working, basically you have the Russian Federation. One thing that would be interesting to play off is the idea of choosing whether you want to have a path similar to how the decolonization path is dealt with in the United Kingdom focus tree. So, for example, you can shatter the Russian, or the previously Soviet and previously before that the Russian Empire. So you have obviously these various nations. You have Ukraine, you have Belarus, and everything like that to gain political power, to gain industrial power for a short time, to potentially become an economic powerhouse. If you want to play that kind of game, I think that would be a very interesting tree or a very interesting path to go down. If you want to focus on the democratic path, mutually exclusive to that path, however, I think would be to build over a sort of a power block in Eastern Europe, where you guarantee Finland, guarantee Poland, guarantee all the Baltic countries. Possibly through decisions, you can somehow gain some industrial favors from the United States, etc., for potentially helping to slow down the fascist threat, or to become sort of a new rising member of the Allies, and take on a majority of the fascist threat yourself before the downfall of France. However, I think this means essentially that you forgo the ability, or you forgo the sort of direct involvement in the German war, to involve yourself initially in the Japanese war. So this would mean that you involve yourself in the Japanese war on the side of obviously the Allies, and you fight the Japanese, maybe even involve yourself within the Chinese-Japanese conflict before it usually pieces out in these days. So you enter on the side of China as a member of the Allies, potentially, or create some sort of Eastern anti-fascist bloc. And I think this would be quite, again, nice flip on the historical path that we see, because in history, obviously, the Soviets, initially, you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, then Barbarossa happens, and the Russians or the Soviets fight the Germans, and in the end they fight the Japanese in the end, basically. However, with the democratic path for Russia, what I think would be a very interesting path to go down would basically involve the Russians against the Germans still, through basically guaranteeing all the neighboring Eastern European countries, even maybe Czechoslovakia, because the Czechoslovakian government and even the Soviet government had actually quite good relations. However, due to the presence and due to the strength of, let's say, the Eastern Coalition, let's call it the Eastern European Coalition, you see that the Russians don't need to have their entire army against the Germans, and you see that they also directly involve themselves mostly against the Japanese, because they're the only ones that can really hurt the Japanese, where it hurts the most, basically Manchuria, blitzing through the various Korean regions, etc. So this would lead probably to a very short war, or a very bombastic war, where basically Russia has to fight on two fronts right away against China and Japan, against Germany and Japan, and it would lead to, again, short campaign, but very dynamic, very much interesting in that way. If you go down the path that is mutually exclusive to maybe shattering your realm to gain economic power. If you shatter your realm to gain economic power and quote-unquote decolonize or get rid of some of the members or the Soviet Socialist states that were previously in the USSR, you could see the Russians focusing mostly on the Japanese, and the Germans not even being all that interested in Russia, because quote-unquote in the Lebensraum doctrine, they're interested in living space in the east, and that could mean Belarus and Ukraine. They don't necessarily have to go after Russia itself, and this would be an interesting take on that whole idea, where maybe the Japanese initiate a conflict with the Russians, or vice versa, and due to some sort of agreement, the Russians and the Germans don't actually find themselves. You have the non-aggression pact sticking. So basically the role of Germany and Japan being reversed in the eyes of the Russians, or the Russian Federation in this case, or the Duma government if you want to call it that. And you know, you forgo maybe some provinces that previously were your cores for a potential economic benefit, and to gain possible new lands in the Asian mainland, or even in the home islands of Japan, because you're extremely close and you can, you know, shift your military focus towards that direction. I think that would be immensely interesting to see, and I think it would play quite a quite different game than what we're used to now when playing as the Soviet Union. When it comes to legacy of Kornilov, Kornilov was sort of a fascisty general that almost managed to grab power of the Russian government, or the Russian state of power. Yeah, you know what I mean. He almost came to power in Russia in 1917, almost beat out the Bolsheviks, and almost managed to basically gain power. And this is the fascist tree. It's not quite 100% fascist or National Socialist as we see within Germany and Italy, but it's sort of the proto-Russian fascism that we see even before the First World War. Sort of a continuation of a previous effort that almost made it, almost got to power in 1917. So I think this is a very interesting play on that idea. And what we see with the legacy of Kornilov is that Russia, or the USSR, and after you go Kornilov would presumably become the Russian Empire or something akin to that. We see that we have the initiation of the Berlin-Moscow axis. Previously this was only possible with Germany initiating the Berlin-Moscow axis. Afterwards, most of the world flips towards the Allies, or the borders, or the bordering countries of Germany and Russia, or Soviet Union, flip towards the Allies, including the United States, which obviously sees this sort of powerhouse of a country joining the Axis a big threat. And I think this is a very good play on that idea. However, after you initiate the Berlin-Moscow axis, due to Kornilov being a general, and due to the immense political instability that preceded him coming to power, even in this scenario in Hearts of Iron 4, obviously, you either went through a civil war, or you had to forgo quite a lot of political benefits due to continuously losing sort of the stability of the previous political party, possibly losing quite a lot of stability as it is in the game. That means that you aren't exactly fully powerful. You aren't all powerful, and I think the once you pick Legacy of Kornilov, it would be interesting to see some sort of national spirit that essentially debuffs you for a time, because that's a rapid change of polarization, or the rapid change in the political system for a country to go through in such a short time, especially if you go through the civil war. And so for a time you should probably get some sort of not just military but also economic debuff, let's say for a year or two, and your participation in the Berlin-Moscow axis, or the axis in general, should be very much just a support role, due to you having, let's say, like a like the 2-year debuff to your military and economic capabilities, even political, let's say. You essentially have to support Germany in their invasions, you help Italy and Africa, you help Japan and China, and you're very much just sort of a supporting role. After you lose those debuffs, you can then focus your full wrath on maybe dominating the British Isles, or you invading the United States and Canada and taking back Alaska, stuff like that. However, Before that, I think his focuses should be mostly relied on slowly decreasing the debuffs until maybe a final focus that completely removes the debuffs if you haven't waited those 2 years. And instead of waiting those 2 years, you can either complete his chain, or instead of completing his chain, you can focus on other aspects of your country, like the economy, the industry, stuff like that. And slowly but surely you would crawl yourselves out of the hole that you dug yourself for this situation to happen. I think this would correspond nicely with the overall situation that even the German focus tree presents with the Berlin-Moscow axis. I think if the player decides to go down the legacy of Kornilov, the German AI should be incentivized to do the Berlin-Moscow axis and to do the focuses that surround the idea of sort of having various military treaties with the USSR quite a lot quicker. Similarly to if the player is playing Manchukuo, the Japanese AI picked the Manchurian project focuses quite a lot sooner than they would normally if the player was playing a country completely separate from the Asian theater of war. So I think this would play around nicely with the idea of you not being a complete OP powerhouse once you join the Axis, because very frequently what we see if the AI goes with the Berlin-Moscow axis the one time in 100 that it actually decides to do something like that, it's incredibly overpowered, and it basically dominates everything and everyone and everything all around the world. And even especially with Italy and Africa, the Soviets are able to completely dominate every theater of war, and the German involvement becomes very secondary, and the Italian involvement becomes almost extinguished in perspective compared to the Red Army stomping everyone. So if you go Legacy of Kornilov, I think you should receive those debuffs to really hamper your ability to progress. Whether these are a national spirit or they are the traits of the leader himself, that's to be debated, but I don't think Kornilov as a general should really have that big of an impact on the economy and the industrial side of things. Maybe due to him being a general, you can gain... of course, he's dead by this time, so the leader that is replacing Kornilov in this sort of situation maybe gains some sort of militaristic boost, or a boost to the capabilities of the army, something akin to that. But whether it is a national spirit or a trait, I think that's mostly what his focus tree should be, or the focus tree of the fascist side of the Russian Empire, or Russia in general, the Soviet Union, should be focused around. And last but not least, when it comes to these like alternate paths or alternate political paths, is the legacy of the Tsar. And this is obviously the non-aligned / broyalist movement that we've seen an uptick in the various national focus trees as of late, and the various DLCs that Paradox has been pushing out. And I think the big idea around the legacy of the Tsar is this crusade against communism. Now, I didn't pick this name just because it was cool sounding and I miss the name from the American focus tree, but I think it could be interesting to see a very similar idea to the Kaiser option when it comes to the German focus tree, where you have the ability to basically join the Allies and expatriate, or basically move out, just send them away, send away all the communists from your country, and they move to France. Now, due to Germany being the size that it is, and due to the political regime that it had in 1936, and obviously if you go down the monarchist path, there isn't much communist support in general in the country. However, if you go down the legacy of the Tsar and you, let's say, exile all the communists from your country, there were quite a lot more communists in the USSR in 1936 than there were in Germany, let me tell you that much. So this idea that I have around legacy of the Tsar and you sending away all the communists is not exactly the same as the Trotsky, where you try to spread a revolution and you have this uptick in communist support in Europe. What I see happening is that the communists could move to France, potentially. However, I think it would be much more interesting and a much better sort of plan for a gameplay perspective if they actually moved to the New World, due to Roosevelt being perceived at the time, and even in some circles to this day, as a very socialist president, and indeed he had passed a lot of social reforms that at the time seemed to some people like borderline like communist reforms with the New Deal and everything. It would be interesting to see with the United States now having a communist tree, as well as Mexico having a communist tree with Trotsky, ironically, and Canada obviously has its communist tree has had it for quite a while now. Would be interesting if the expatriated communists move to the New World, and you see an uptick in communist support in the United States, Mexico, Canada, and South America, and all of the Americas, because what I imagine this legacy of the Tsar and this sort of reignited Romanov legacy sparking around not just Europe but the world is this sort of idea that communism was a mistake. For example, you see a lot of the story of the murders being published by the Romanovs, and due to the history that family had with the previous regime, obviously they aren't too keen on the communists. So you see a lot of options in their focus tree to turn various nations in the continent of Europe monarchist. So if you pick Legacy of the Tsar as Russia or the Soviet Union, that would basically mean that you have the ability to flip again the various nations that belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, similarly to the focus tree that the Kaiser Germany has, or Germany that picked the Kaiser option, the oppose Hitler option. Again, you can also do very similar things to, for example, Germany. They would probably go through a civil war. You have a very interesting situation where even if they pick Rhineland, due to the increased influence from the Romanovs and the sort of hatred of communism, you see that the monarchist support due to Wilhelm II, the Wilhelm II being the cousin and very much related to Nicholas II and on pretty decent terms with the rest of the Romanovs. You see that you see an uptick in the popularity. Britain probably would go down the monarchist option and the monarchist option for the country, and the colonies wouldn't revolt in this situation because there's an increased threat from the communists, which is bigger than the one that the royal marriage proposes, let's say. So I think the situation will very much be sort of a new world versus the old one situation, where Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the newly reformed Tsarist Russia and Britain would face off against United States and possibly half of Canada, due to it being sort of a split 50-50 between the communist support from the now exiled Russian Soviet communists and the rest of the Americas. So South America would become basically the bastion of communism, let's say, with Mexico and Trotsky and everything like that. I think it would be incredibly interesting to see how that would play off in a gameplay situation. I think it would propose a very big challenge to the player that decides to play as Russia in this situation, because not only do you have to face off with the old world, which isn't that powerful at the beginning of the game. Surely, Germany is powerful, but they have to go through a civil war. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, even if you make it form, isn't all that powerful due to the various restrictions that individual nations have within that empire. If you decide to form it, you could also do the monarchist path for Italy. That would be very interesting. However, then their focus tree is very lackluster. And Britain, of course, has its internal issues and them not being extraordinarily powerful in comparison to the entirety of the America. So it would basically play off a very interesting sense in a gameplay-wise, and prove quite a challenge. So Legacy of the Duma, democratic path, various options, how you want to how you want to conduct yourself within the war. Do you want to stay neutral against Germany and focus on Japan, or do you want to do sort of two things at once? Then the legacy of Kornilov, do you want to initially be debuffed and then later on gain your power and potentially control the entirety of the world with the Germans? That would be quite interesting. And legacy of the Tsar basically makes you fight the entirety of the Americas, which is quite a very big fight. And so that's basically the alternate historical political path for the USSR. However, another set of ideas that I'm not entirely sure if they would be very applicable to the political side of the game or the sort of foreign relations side of the game. I think these three options should or could be implemented in their own separate way. Could also be integrated into the political decisions or some sort of within the decision factor of the game. I mean, like you pick the various decisions for political power, etc. And that is your sort of foreign secretary or your foreign relations of the various countries. So within the spectrum of the historical period we are talking about, the Soviet Union basically went from Litvinov, who was very much pro-Western, pro-Allies, to Molotov, who was sort of more flexible and more Stalinist, and then we have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact forming. And the third option is the Third Rome, which is way out there, but I think it's very interesting. So starting with Litvinov, this is an idea very similar to that I posed with the legacy of the Duma. However, this could also apply to the communist branches, more specifically to the Stalinist branch. And interestingly enough, I think it benefits the Stalinist branch the most, and I think this would even be more akin to be directly involved within the Stalinist branch, and even the decision between Molotov and Litvinov could be directly involved within the Stalinist branch, as well as the Democratic branch. However, they're so far apart, and I'm not entirely sure how that would be even possible, so I think that you'd have to make that a separate tree. But what this means is that initially around 1935, 1936, and up to the beginning of the war, basically up until he got kicked out in favor of Molotov, we see that Russia the Soviet Union was very favorable towards the Western Allies up until basically the Sudeten crisis and the Munich quote-unquote betrayal of Czechoslovakia, and they essentially wanted to form a pact of Eastern European sort of allies, or sort of an Eastern coalition, very much akin to, let's say, the Entente in the West, that would be able to somehow block out the fascists from gaining more prevalence after the Anschluss. And initially, of course, the Eastern powers were sort of like, that's kind of interesting, but when the Russians proposed, or the Soviets proposed, that they would move their armies directly through the borders of Poland to help them defend, they were very much against it because of their experience in the Soviet-Polish War 1920. They didn't really trust the Soviets at all. They presumed that the Russians would just never leave, which is quite probable in all retrospect and all sort of hindsight, whatever. However, this was only possible up until the Sudeten thing. So you could limit the Litvinov decision to period of time before the Sudeten crisis happens, and so the player has to be quick to pick this, or you could limit it to the Stalinist tree, you could limit it to the Democratic tree. However, what I think would be interesting is to really see how the Soviets would be able to circumvent the various hostilities that they face from Poland, Romania, etc., etc., and the Baltic states, especially. Oh, there we go. So maybe through the various decisions, you could do some political favors for them. For example, for 100 political power, you can boost relations to 100, or maybe you can take on some of their economic burdens for them. Like you lose, let's say, 2 civilian factories for 50 days, and they gain 2 civilian factories for 50 days, or something akin to that. And that would obviously make them more willing to cooperate with you, because they see that, okay, these guys are actually taking that seriously, and then you would be able to form this pact, or this anti-fascist Eastern European pact, even if you're not doing the legacy of the Duma. So this would be maybe only restricted to the decisions, could also be implemented into the Stalinist focus tree. However, it would be very interesting to see how the player would choose their individual allies, because you could forego all your political power just to focus on forming this anti-fascist pact, and making you that much sturdier when facing off against the Germans, who are inevitably coming, and who you would be facing off against with the sort of the entire coalition of eastern countries. Or you could only focus on maybe Romania to, for example, limit the fascist access to oil, or only focus on Poland to faster enter into the war, or you only focus on Czechoslovakia to limit the German accessibility to the Škoda Industries, or the Škoda industrial power, and you sort of limit them in their ability to go to the Sudetenland crisis, and you become one of the participants in the Munich conference, let's say. So similarly how Britain and France have the ability to leave the Czechs to their fate or support them, Russia would now, or the Soviet Union would now also have the ability to decide if they want to support Czechoslovakia or leave them to their fate. Because as I said, historically they were very much keen on protecting Czechoslovakia. However, they were not actually given a table by they were not actually invited to the overall conference, which very much disheartened them, and then led them to Molotov, who I'm going to talk about now. So with Molotov, it's sort of interesting. I imagine it would be dealt with similarly with various decisions in the game to the Litvinov side. However, this time you're more focused on gaining favors with the Axis. So this directly builds upon the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And just before the Barbarossa invasion, you see that Ribbentrop actually proposed that to Molotov that the USSR would become a member of the Tripartite Act, which we've seen with Japan and Italy and Germany, obviously, in the game. So this could work in various ways. You could have an event chain, or the decision chain, or focus tree chain, or focus chain, I suppose, that would basically make you more friendly with the Axis. You give them political power while you stay out of the war entirely, or not political power, but industrial power. Give them weapons, give them volunteers, etc., etc., while staying Stalinist and doing your little striking the South or whatever you want to do, without being directly involved in the Second World War. However, you could also just straight up join either the Eastern Co-Prosperity Sphere or, of course, the Axis. Doesn't really matter. Either way, you're fighting the Western Allies. And this will be interesting because I think this should cost a lot of political power and a lot of industrial power, due to Germany obviously having to forgo its ambitions to do the whole Lebensraum thing, having to be content with what they grabbed from Poland and Memel, and obviously the Anschluss of Austria and Czechoslovakia, and etc., etc. So, to stay safe from the fascists, you have to forgo a lot of political power and a lot of industrial power, but you would gain the ability to do your little empire building on your own without having to fear any sort of repercussions from the Allies, because they wouldn't be willing to guarantee any nation that is being attacked by the USSR, because they don't want the USSR to get directly militarily involved against the Allies. Now, if it would be interesting how Paradox actually would deal with this. It would sort of go against the entire doctrine of no more appeasement. However, through sort of a realpolitik take on the overall situation, you might see the AI or a player go either way, either just directly involving themselves in the conflict against the Soviets, not really caring, ultimately probably leading to the defeat of the Allies, because now the British Raj not only has to worry about Japan but also the Soviet Union, and obviously the entirety of the Scandinavian thing being just done. And so the last option is the Third Rome, and this is very much playing off the fascist tree that I spoke about earlier. However, I think this could also be applicable to the monarchist tree, as well as the democratic tree, if you do not go for the whole shattering of the empire, let's say. the way I imagine this going is that you basically form an alliance, similar to how the Italians have their Novus Imperium Romanum alliance with Russia, because they're quote-unquote the third Rome, obviously the Roman Empire being the first Rome, the Eastern Roman Empire, the Empire of the Romans, or the Byzantine Empire, whatever you want to call it, being the second Rome, and Russia, the Russian Empire, and even modern Russian Federation. It's complicated, being the third Rome. Because they carry on the Orthodox legacy of the Second Empire, etc., etc. Sort of convoluted, but it would be very interesting. And I think one of the best implications of this would be not Russia immediately gaining power through like conquering stuff, but actually helping Greece and Italy retake some of their lands that they were either promised or they lost historically. So, for example, with Greece, if Russia decides to go with Third Rome, they would essentially help Greece retake all the lands that belonged to the Byzantine Empire, or that are required in the game for the player to be able to recreate the Byzantine Empire. So, for example, this could be done through the various ultimatum systems that the ultimatum system, of course, that is in present game at this moment. So, for example, Russia or Greece could have some sort of event or have some sort of a decision that they would pick through demand Istanbul, let's say. Istanbul or war, let's call it. And or Turkey, Anatolia or war, something akin to that. And basically they would then, the Turkish AI or player would have to either decide to fight off against both Russia and Greece, or just submit and basically exit the game. Or same thing with Yugoslavia, Romania, and Albania, etc., etc. And essentially this would expand on the alliance system that we now have in the game, because I think it's very barren. In the game right now we don't really see any sort of meaningful interactions between the allies within an alliance, except for the exiled nation or the exiled government system, which is sort of bare bones, and the just a standard allied system, which basically makes you fight a war but doesn't really make you cooperate in any sort of meaningful way. So this is more of a cooperative effort. And even in multiplayer game, if you decide to do this, very much benefits the players that play in a cooperative way. And I think it would be quite interesting to maybe then have some sort of really expensive decision to make, for example, reintegrate the Byzantine Empire into the quote-unquote Third Rome, which is now Russia. So through various decisions or focuses, you have the ability to support Italy in gaining various Yugoslav lands, and Greece to take various Middle Eastern lands, and to then remake the Byzantine Empire and to partially remake some sort of desired Italian empire, or at least regain the provinces that they were promised after the First World War and they didn't gain. For example, Dalmatia and Slovenia, stuff like that. And ultimately they didn't get them. So through this focus tree would help them regain those through ultimatums, political meddling, stuff like that. And then later on down the line you would basically reintegrate them into the empire, or integrate them into the empire, calling the new nation Rome, essentially, or the Third Rome, or a new Rome, something akin to that. Very similar to, for example, how we see the Imperial Federation working with the United Kingdom now in the Man the Guns DLC. I think this would be quite a good play on the idea of the Third Rome. It's not on the same level as Litvinov and Molotov, it's much more grander, but it limits your alliances, and it makes you weaker in some senses and more powerful in some other senses. And finally we move on to the last one. It's been a long video, I know, but I just had to talk about all this stuff. Finally we get to the military side of things. And what you find with the Soviet Union during this period of time, especially after the Great Purge and after all the various political things that went on in the Soviet Union during the 1930s and 40s, you see that there's a lot of political involvement when it comes to the military side of things. And this is partially dealt with already in the vanilla game with army rehabilitation and NKVD primacy. And this proposed overhaul I'm sort of scheming up here is sort of a build on that idea, with you having two mutually exclusive focuses, either political primacy or army primacy. With political primacy, it essentially takes the role of the NKVD primacy that we have in the game right now. It makes you gain political power, manpower, and it increases your recruitment speed, or your ability to create units, basically. And this is also sort of a play on the immense difficulties the Red Army went through during the expansion years of 1939, 1940, 1941, and also the involvement of the NKVD, but also on the gameplay mechanic of the communist branch and the generic focus tree, mostly being focused around stability and political power. So you see that this is sort of the indoctrination path. Maybe the recruitment speed is a little bit off due to that being already present in the mass mob doctrine. However, I think you need some sort of balancing act, because just political power and manpower isn't enough to make this viable. But you have to forgo organization, defense, and research speed of various military texts, and various other debuffs, which is just sort of comprehended in that, etc. Which those debuffs could be just stability, or war support, or maybe the quickness that your generals gain traits, something akin to that. However, I think this is quite a good base point for balancing, because if you initially pick political primacy, you're gonna have a lot of political power, and this builds off, or this nicely balances itself with, for example, Trotsky or Stalin. If you pick those two leaders within the political decision tab, or maybe even the legacy of the Duma or Kornilov, because what this means is that you have a lot of political power to spend, you have a lot of stuff to do to build up your industry and stuff like that. However, what this means is that your military is basically terrible initially, and then you have the ability to spend political power to gain back some of your lost abilities through the political primacy focus. For example, very similarly to how China and Japan worked after the Waking the Tiger DLC. Japan obviously has to spend political power to gain attack bonuses against China. China has to spend army experience to decorrupt or decrease the corruption of their army and increase their military prowess. So with political primacy, you lose the initial edge that you might have in the army side. However, through spending political power, you gain some of those lost buffs. So for example, after you spend at first the debuffs, let's say 50% less organization, after you spend 100 or 50 political power, it's only minus 40%, etc, etc. You get the idea. This is very much a long-term plan if you want to focus mostly on nation building first, or mostly on building up your nation. Nation building, it's very different. Building up your nation first and then going to war. And army primacy is very much, let's say, the Spiritu Nova focus tree that I proposed at the beginning. This is very much balancing with that. This is very much something that would benefit that type of player that likes to spend his early years or the early game just going through a lot of military actions and building up their country as quickly as possible through military means, taking over small neighbors and stuff like that. So I think this would benefit the that type of aggressive player very, very seriously, especially in the early game. And by spending army experience, which you're probably going to get by invading a lot of those countries, you're going to then slowly increase your capabilities when it comes to political power, manpower, and recruitment speed. And however, your organization, defense, and research speed stays. You regain those bonuses, you retain those bonuses, but you reduce those nerfs or debuffs, and ultimately gain rid of them by spending army experience. The rest of the military focus tree, I think, should or could remain the same as it is in the base game, where you basically have the difference of either individualism or individual heroism or collectivism. And I think that focus tree isn't too terrible. However, it lacks quite a lot of substance when it comes to various buffs for research speed of guns or tanks, which is dealt with by the German focus tree, but I think if you decide to not go with helping the Germans, the Soviets should have the ability to at least somewhat do some research on their own, which would this is just a basic building blocks: the political primacy and the armor primacy. Every other focus after that is not mutually exclusive or shouldn't be, and you can basically do just your standard military stuff after that. However, the initial decision very much guides you through your game and decides. Alright, so this was a very different video to the ones I usually do. Hopefully it wasn't too long for you guys, hopefully it wasn't too boring for you guys, but this is something that I really wanted to talk about for a long time, because I think there's a lot of ideas that Paradox could implement into making the Soviet Union quite a bit more interesting, at least the various Soviet leaders. That's the one that I really want the most. So anyway, thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.